The woman on my porch was holding my mother's Bible so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Then she whispered, "Ma'am, are you sure you know what your mother left you?" I'd been home from my final army deployment for 4 days. 24 years in uniform, and I thought the hardest part of retirement would be learning to sleep without boots by the bed. I was wrong. Because in 6 minutes, that stranger was about to hand me a Bible my husband had sold for $3, and inside it was a secret that would end my marriage, expose my mother-in-law's crumbling business, and reveal that my mother had been protecting me from the grave. My name is Rebecca Hayes. I was 46 years old, a master sergeant stationed out of Fort Riley, less than 2 months from full retirement. My husband, Daniel, and I lived in a tan split level on the west side of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the kind of street where every driveway had a basketball hoop and everyone noticed a garage sale sign before it was even nailed to the post. I'd spent 24 years learning to trust my instincts under pressure, supply convoys, dust storms, 3 deployments overseas, more sleepless nights than I could count. I'd always assumed that once I hung up my uniform for good, the hardest thing I'd have to adjust to was silence. No radio traffic. Number 4 a.m. alerts. Just an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and a husband who'd been patient enough to wait through every one of those deployments. That Friday afternoon, I was finally unpacking boxes from my last posting when the doorbell rang. The woman at my door introduced herself as Helen Brooks, early 70s, silver hair, a pale blue cardigan buttoned to her throat. "I bought this from your husband," she said, holding out a worn brown Bible, its leather cracked at the spine, my mother's name, Margaret Collins, still stamped in fading gold across the bottom. My stomach dropped. "That isn't possible." "He sold it Saturday morning," Helen said gently. $3. $3. My mother had carried that Bible to church for nearly 40 years. Grocery lists in the margins. Funeral programs tucked between psalms. When cancer took her 3 years earlier, that Bible was the one thing I'd asked to keep. I let Helen inside. Daniel was in the kitchen pouring coffee into a travel mug, and when he saw what she was holding, his hand froze on the lid. "You sold my mother's Bible?" I asked. He gave a short laugh, not a happy one. "It was sitting in a box in the guest room, Rebecca. You weren't using it." But he had no idea that Helen hadn't come to return a Bible. She'd come because something inside it had already changed everything, and in less than 60 seconds, I was about to find out what. Helen didn't hand the Bible over right away. Instead, she opened it carefully to the Book of Psalms, where something thick rested between the pages, wrapped in yellowed paper and tied with a narrow blue ribbon. Daniel's face lost every trace of color. That was the moment I realized my husband already knew exactly what my mother had left hidden inside. "I opened it Sunday night," Helen said quietly. "I wasn't searching for anything. It just fell open, and something slipped out. I wrapped it back exactly the way I found it. Before I give this to you, I need to know, did your mother ever ask you to promise something about this Bible?" I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back in the hospital, my mother squeezing my hand with more strength than I thought she had left. "Promise me one thing. Keep my Bible. No matter what." At the time I'd thought she meant it sentimentally. Sitting in my living room now, I understood she'd meant something else entirely. Daniel grabbed his keys without finishing his coffee. "I've got to get to work," he mumbled, and I heard his truck disappear down the street a minute later. Helen looked at the front door, then back at me. "I don't think your husband expected anyone to bring this Bible back." Neither did I. But what was taped inside the cover was about to turn a sold Bible into the first piece of evidence in a case my mother had built years before she died. Inside the wrapped paper was a handwritten letter and a tiny brass key, no bigger than my thumb, with the number 417 stamped into the side. My mother's handwriting was steady. "Rebecca, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I prayed you would simply keep this Bible on your shelf and never need what's hidden inside. There are things I never told you because I hoped I never would have to. After your father died, I discovered people can smile at your table while quietly planning your future for you. I turned the page. The letter simply ended, not because she'd finished, but because the bottom half had been torn away. The last complete sentence read, "The rest is where your father always kept." Nothing after that. No location. No signature. Helen leaned forward. When I found it, it was already like that. I didn't remove anything. I know, I told her. I believe you. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel, "Don't let that woman fill your head with stories. Mom says old people like attention." I actually laughed, because it sounded exactly like something my mother-in-law, Carol, would say. Helen hesitated before she left. I almost didn't bring the Bible back. The day after the garage sale, your husband came to my house and offered me $500 to buy it back. $500 for a Bible he'd called just taking up space. That single detail told me Daniel wasn't cleaning out a closet. He was trying to undo a mistake, and I was only just beginning to understand how big that mistake really was. I locked the key, the torn letter, and Helen's bank card in my nightstand and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I heard Daniel go downstairs. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I slipped out without turning on a light and found him in the guest room, phone flashlight in hand, tearing through my mother's cedar chest, photo albums, ornaments, her sewing basket, all landing on the floor. "Looking for something?" I asked. He nearly dropped his phone. I was looking for the lawnmower title. In my mother's cedar chest? Neither of us believed it. He muttered something about going back to bed and left me to repack the chest myself. The next morning, he kissed my forehead like nothing had happened. I drove straight to Linda Foster's porch across the street, 30 years of watching the neighborhood from that same swing. "Your husband didn't want anybody near those boxes," Linda told me over sweet tea. "He kept flipping through your mother's Bible. Shaking it. Putting it back." She paused. "And Rebecca, the sale wasn't even his idea. Your mother-in-law organized the whole thing. I heard her tell him, if it isn't there, then it's somewhere else in the house." They weren't cleaning out a guest room. They were searching. And when I pulled up our security camera footage that afternoon, I finally saw exactly what they'd been looking for, and how long they'd been looking for it. The cameras had 60 days of storage. At 10:47 the night before the garage sale, Daniel climbed into the attic with a flashlight. At 11:18, Carol followed. For nearly 40 minutes, they tore through boxes, old trunks, insulation, furniture, until Carol pointed to a box marked Mother's Church Things. The same box that held the Bible. I watched Daniel flip through every page, shake it upside down. Nothing fell out. His shoulders slumped. Carol crossed her arms, and though the camera had no audio, I could read her lips clearly enough. "Keep looking." I played it 3 more times, hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. The next morning I texted Daniel that I was running errands. He replied that he'd be late, unusual, since he hated texting. I slipped the brass key into my purse and drove downtown to First National Bank of Lynn County. The address printed on Helen's card, 3 words written on the back in blue ink, "Ask about 417." I had no idea that the moment I walked through those bank doors, I was about to learn something my mother had kept even more carefully hidden than the Bible itself. Branch manager Karen Mitchell confirmed the key belonged to a box registered to Margaret Collins, my mother, untouched since her death. "Who's authorized to access it?" I asked. "You are. Sole owner." Karen paused. "Our records show someone came in about 3 months ago asking about box 417. They became very upset when they learned they weren't authorized. I didn't have to ask who." Karen led me through a heavy steel vault door lined with rows of identical metal boxes. She stopped in front of number 417, inserted her master key alongside my small brass one, and the lock clicked open on the first try. She carried the box into a private viewing room and left me alone with it, saying only, "Take as much time as you need." I sat there for a moment before lifting the lid, remembering my mother laughing over coffee one winter morning years earlier. Sometimes the safest place isn't where people think to look. At the time I'd assumed she meant Christmas presents hidden from curious grandchildren. Sitting in that quiet room, I understood she'd meant something else entirely. Inside the box, old family photographs, my father's Bronze Star citation, property records tied with twine, and on top, a white envelope with 7 words written across the front in my mother's unmistakable hand. "Open only if Daniel ever betrays you." My hands went numb. Inside was a letter explaining that after my father died, Daniel had visited her more than once, asking about her savings, the farm, what would happen to everything after she was gone. She'd transferred our 22-acre family farm outside Mount Vernon into an irrevocable trust nearly 5 years before she died. I was the sole beneficiary. Not Daniel. Not us both. Just me. My mother hadn't hated Daniel. She simply hadn't trusted him, and she'd been building a case against that possibility for years before either of us knew there was a game being played at all. Walking to my car, my phone buzzed. "Daniel, meeting got cancelled. Thought I'd swing by the bank to deposit a check." "Where are you?" He didn't know I was already at the bank. Unless he wasn't asking, he was checking. Across the lot, under a maple tree, sat his silver F-150. Not parked to come inside. Parked to watch the entrance. The moment he saw me spot him, he drove off without ever coming in. He hadn't followed me over a paycheck. He'd followed me to find out whether I'd opened box 417. I called attorney Linda Carson, the same name on my mother's trust paperwork, and sat in her office an hour later while she read through everything. "Your mother was incredibly thorough," she said. Then she pulled county property records onto her screen. "Rebecca, you refinanced this house 3 years ago." "No, we didn't. According to the county, your husband did." She turned the screen toward me. My signature was on the paperwork. Close enough to fool most people. Not close enough to fool someone who'd signed military documents for 24 years. That signature wasn't mine. And the $80,000 loan attached to it was about to lead straight back to the one person I never expected to be involved. Linda kept digging. A home equity line of credit, nearly $80,000, taken out under a forged signature. No luxury cars, no vacations to explain it, so where had it gone? 10 more minutes of searching, and Linda stopped typing. "I think I found your mother-in-law." 6 months earlier, Carol had invested in a struggling antique shop through a silent partner contribution of $75,000. Almost exactly what Daniel had borrowed. "He used our house," I said slowly, "to finance his mother's business." "Without your knowledge," Linda confirmed. I remembered Daniel at my hospital bedside after shoulder surgery, holding my hand at my mother's funeral, kissing me goodbye before every deployment. Had any of it been real? "You're wondering if you wasted 22 years, Linda said gently. "Something like that. You spent 22 years being honest. He's the one who wasted them." I didn't want revenge just because I was angry. I wanted the truth out in the open, and Linda promised me the consequences would take care of themselves once it was. What neither of us knew yet was exactly how public that reveal was about to become. For 3 days I acted normal. Daniel kissed me goodbye every morning, complained about gas prices, watched the Cubs after work. I smiled when I had to and watched everything else. By Thursday, Linda had found more. Over 18 months, Daniel had quietly moved nearly $22,000 out of our joint savings, $3,000 here, $2,000 there, always labeled home improvement or equipment purchase, always timed while I was rotating through training and deployments. Every dollar eventually landed in accounts tied to Carol's shop, which according to the accountant's own emails, was losing money fast and would likely close without another injection of cash. "That's why they wanted the farm," Linda said. The trust protected it. So they looked elsewhere, your house, your savings, and eventually, whatever they believed your mother had hidden. I thought about Carol mouthing, "Keep looking in that attic footage." She hadn't been curious. She'd been desperate. "Have you told Daniel you know any of this?" Linda asked. "No." "Good. Tomorrow night is Earl Jensen's neighborhood barbecue, isn't it?" I hadn't even mentioned the barbecue. Linda already had a plan for it, and she was about to tell me exactly how I was going to use it. "Don't accuse. Don't argue," Linda told me. "Just ask questions." I asked her why that mattered so much. She set down her pen and looked at me the way I imagined she looked at every client who walked into her office convinced their whole life had just collapsed. "Because accusations put people on the defensive," she said. "Questions put them in a corner. There's a difference. One makes them fight back. The other makes them explain themselves in front of people who are listening." She was right, and I knew it the moment she said it. 24 years of debriefing soldiers after difficult missions had taught me the exact same lesson, just in a different uniform. Friday evening, Daniel grilled burgers in our backyard as if nothing had changed. Carol arrived with her famous baked beans and hugged me too tightly. "How's retirement treating my favorite daughter-in-law?" By the time we walked over to Earl Jensen's yard, nearly 30 neighbors had gathered, lawn chairs, paper plates, country music from a Bluetooth speaker. Daniel laughed with the crowd. Carol accepted compliments on her casserole. You'd never guess either of them had spent months tearing apart my mother's belongings or quietly draining our accounts. Linda arrived with her husband and caught my eye across the yard, one small nod. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Karen Mitchell at the bank. "Rebecca, I found one additional document in box 417 that had slipped beneath the tray. I think you'll want to see it." Daniel was mid-joke, everyone around him laughing. He had no idea the final piece of my mother's plan had just surfaced, and he had even less idea that in about 10 minutes, I was going to sit down across from him and start asking questions he couldn't answer. I carried my plate to the picnic table where Daniel and Carol were already seated. "I stopped by First National Bank yesterday," I said casually. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Only for a second." "I saw it anyway. I found out my mother rented a safety deposit box," I continued. "There was a letter inside. It explained why she put the farm into a trust." Carol looked down at her plate. Daniel tried to sound relaxed. "What did it say?" "She mentioned someone visited her several times asking about her property." "Rebecca, I never knew you spent so much time with my mother," Daniel said, blinking. "You visited her. You never told me." "I didn't think it mattered," he said. Carol jumped in. "Daniel was only trying to help your mother," but I just nodded slowly and asked the question Linda had prepared me for. "So why did you try to buy her Bible back for $500? The table went completely silent. Even Earl's speaker seemed to fade into the background. Daniel finally looked at me like a man who understood, for the first time in our marriage, that he was no longer controlling the conversation. And what came out of his mouth next confirmed everything I'd already found. "Who told you that?" Daniel asked. "I'm asking you a question." "It was sentimental," he said. "That's interesting," I said evenly, "because 4 days ago you told me it was just taking up space." Neither of them had an answer. I kept going, calm, no raised voice. "Why did you search every page before you sold it?" "My security cameras recorded you and Carol going through my mother's belongings the night before the garage sale." Several neighbors exchanged looks. Carol's face drained of color. "You're making this sound much worse than it was," she said. "Then help me understand," I said. "You searched my attic. You searched her keepsakes. You searched her Bible. What exactly were you looking for?" Carol opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That was when Linda stepped forward, not as my friend anymore, but as my attorney. Mr. Hayes, she said evenly, perhaps it would help if we discussed the home equity loan. Earl Jensen, standing 3 feet away with a plate of ribs, blurted out the one question that made the entire backyard go still. What loan? You refinanced your marital home, Linda said, looking only at Daniel. You forged your wife's signature. Approximately $80,000 was borrowed. The neighbors stared. Daniel looked around for someone to rescue him. No one did. I was going to tell her when the business turned around, he finally said. What business? Carol's eyes filled with panic. Daniel. He ignored her. My mother's antique store. It needed help. You gave her our money, I said. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. His voice rose. I was trying to save her by risking our house. I was going to pay it back. I stayed quiet for a moment, then said the only thing that mattered. I believed you every time you told me you were handling the finances. I believed you every time you kissed me goodbye before training. I believed you because that's what marriage is supposed to be. Daniel lowered his head. I never wanted to hurt you. I think you stopped asking whether you were hurting me a long time ago. Carol suddenly stood up, furious, and said something that told the entire backyard exactly who she blamed for all of it, and it wasn't her son. This is all Margaret's fault, Carol snapped, loud enough for half the yard to hear. She never trusted us. I looked at her steadily. No, she didn't. And today, I finally understand why. Linda handed me the certified bank copies. I looked at Daniel one last time. My mother's trust protects the farm. You have no claim to it. And thanks to these documents, there's now a clear record of everything you've done. He looked completely defeated. Carol looked around the yard, realizing every neighbor who'd complimented her baked beans an hour earlier was now staring at her in silence. My phone buzzed again, Karen's reminder about the affidavit waiting at the bank. Daniel thought this humiliating dinner was the worst part of his night. He had no idea there was still one final document my mother had hidden, one she'd notarized years in advance, and timed for the exact moment I would finally be ready to read it. I was outside First National Bank before it opened the next morning. Karen led me to the same private room, lifted the felt lining from box 417, and there it was, a document that had slipped beneath the tray years earlier. Affidavit of intent. Signed by my mother, witnessed by 2 neighbors, notarized by Linda Carson nearly 4 years before she passed. Alone in that room, I read every word. My mother described Daniel's repeated visits, his questions about her savings and the farm, his insistence that keeping everything simple would make life easier for me after retirement. Then one sentence stopped me cold. I don't believe Daniel married my daughter for money, but I do believe money has changed the man she married. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't cruel. She was simply telling the truth as she saw it, and building a paper trail strong enough to protect me even after she was gone. She hadn't just left me a Bible and a farm. She'd left me evidence, timed to surface at exactly the moment I would need it most, and the weeks that followed moved faster than I ever expected. Daniel admitted to forging my signature. His attorney negotiated rather than fight the paper trail Linda had assembled, the security footage, the bank records, my mother's letters. The home equity debt became part of our divorce settlement, and he accepted responsibility for every dollar of it. Carol eventually sold her antique shop at a loss. We never spoke again. The family farm stayed exactly where my parents had wanted it, protected, untouched, mine. That fall, I moved into the old farmhouse outside Mount Vernon. I repaired the porch with help from 2 retired neighbors and planted tomatoes where my father once kept his garden. Some mornings I'd stand in that kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out over the same fields my father had walked every day of his life, and feel something I hadn't expected to feel after everything that had happened, peace. Linda checked in every few weeks, mostly out of friendship rather than business by that point. You know, she told me once, sitting on my new porch with a glass of lemonade, most people in your situation spend years angry. You skipped straight to rebuilding. I told her I didn't have the energy left for anger. My mother had spent her final years quietly building me a way out. The least I could do was actually walk through the door she'd left open. On Sunday mornings, I carried my mother's Bible to the small white church she'd attended for decades, not because I thought it was lucky, but because every crease and handwritten note reminded me of a woman who'd loved me enough to prepare for a future she hoped would never come. I still keep Helen Brooks's first business card tucked inside the Bible's front cover. If she'd simply kept it on her own shelf that Sunday night, I might never have learned any of this. One quiet act of honesty from a stranger changed the rest of my life. I thought the story ended there, with the farm safe, the divorce final, and Daniel gone. But 3 months later, a second letter arrived at my new farmhouse, and it wasn't from anyone I expected. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, my name typed instead of handwritten. Inside was a single page from Karen Mitchell at First National Bank, along with a note. Rebecca, I wasn't supposed to share this, but I think you deserve to know. Before your mother passed, she asked us to flag box 417 for one additional review 5 years after her death, regardless of who had already accessed it. That review happens next month. I don't know what she left for that date specifically, but given everything else she planned, I didn't think you'd want to be caught off guard again. I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter for a long time, staring at my mother's Bible on the counter beside it. She hadn't just protected me from Daniel. She'd built something with a timeline that stretched years beyond her own death, something even I didn't fully understand yet. And in exactly 1 month, I was going to walk back into that vault one final time, open a box my mother had planned around for half a decade, and find out what she'd been protecting me from long before I ever knew there was anything left to fear. Sometimes I still think about that Friday afternoon when Helen Brooks stood on my porch, holding my mother's Bible like it might slip away from her if she loosened her grip even slightly. If she'd simply placed it on her own shelf, none of this ever comes to light. Instead, one small act of honesty from a woman who owed me nothing changed the entire direction of my life. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of it, it's this: trust is precious, but wisdom matters just as much. The people who truly love us don't always leave behind money or property. Sometimes what they leave is the truth, carefully protected, patiently timed, and waiting until the exact moment we're finally ready to see it. People sometimes ask me if I regret the 22 years I spent with Daniel. I understand why they ask. It's a fair question after everything that came out in that backyard. But the truth is, I don't regret loving someone, or believing the version of him I married actually existed for a while. What I regret is how long it took me to notice the moment that version quietly disappeared, replaced by someone willing to forge my name on a piece of paper rather than simply ask me for help. My mother never lived to see any of this unfold. She never got to watch Daniel's face drain of color at that picnic table, never got to see Karen slide box 417 back into the vault one final time. In some ways, I think that was exactly how she wanted it. She wasn't trying to win an argument from beyond the grave. She was trying to make sure that whatever happened, I would never be standing there without proof, without protection, without someone, even in her absence, quietly on my side. I think about Helen Brooks often, too. A retired schoolteacher who spent 42 years learning to recognize when someone was lying to her, and who used that same skill on a random Friday afternoon to decide that a stranger's Bible deserved to go home rather than sit on her own shelf collecting dust. She never asked for anything in return. She didn't want credit, didn't want to be part of the story that followed. She simply did the quiet, unremarkable thing that turned out to matter more than almost anything else that happened afterward. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly looked out for you long before you realized it, I hope you'll think of them today.